Good evening WTU, this is your founder Phil Monk, doing a bit of late o'clock news. I just thought I'd share some of my thoughts and reflections on the outcome of the Gibson trial. It is a late impromptu live feed. I've been trying to write notes all day in between all my other activities, and I've printed them off. As always, I've got a bit to say, it seems. I will of course remind you all before we go any further about Alan Buffrey's compilation of poems from the community, Inside My Hat and Other Heads. This is available on Amazon for £10 and a penny. Free delivery by that price, and £3.50 raised from every book will be donated, I believe now, to the WTU fund, now that the Gibson's case has come to an end. So if you would like to support the WTU and get a nice compilation of some fantastic poems that you can gift or keep for yourself, please pop over to Amazon, pay your capital gains tax, which I wouldn't normally ever dream of endorsing, but under these circumstances I've made an exception. So on that note, I'm just going to share with you some of my thoughts and reflections. Now, some of you may have seen my original jubilant live feed when we had the original news from JJ, Craig, Paul and everyone else that managed to get up to Carlisle. First off, a big shout out to all of you guys for going out there, taking the time and the effort to get yourselves up there. It's fantastic of you for doing so. There is now being created a group, the name escapes me, it's about supporting people at court. So if any of you in this group are in the process of being charged, have a court date, and you would like to have a show of support at the court, or even if the WTU community can advise or support in any way, then please let us know and we'll do anything at all that we can to help. Now, I'm going to, I suppose, read it out like a news report. WTU TV. On the 6th of January 2020, the test case of Leslie and Mark Gibson was scheduled to commence over a 4-day period. Mark and Leslie have been through months of stress and were facing prosecution for the unlicensed cultivation and preparation of cannabis for medical purposes. Many shouted in triumph and glee when the Gibsons' ordeal was finally brought to an end, as they were acquitted when the prosecution announced in the hours before the trial commenced that the prosecution would bring no evidence against the Gibsons, as it was not in the public interest to prosecute them. Perhaps this is because the Gibsons may have called on the CPS to provide their foundation evidence for the Schedule 1 status of cannabis, or their proof of controls. After all, no such foundation evidence has ever existed, as cannabis prohibition laws have always been unfounded, based on bias, lies, bigotry and political bias and greed. And this is evidently continued and maintained by the government of today with their ideological driven war on cannabis, which is really a war on our freedom of choice, health and well-being, and our fundamental human rights to a private life, and to seek the most dignified quality of life possible in our own individual circumstances. Why did the CPS leave it until the last moments to decide it is not in the public interest to prosecute the Gibsons? Perhaps it is to try and test their nerve, to call their bluff, in the hope that the Gibsons would crumble under the threats of prison and prosecution. Regardless of whatever the reason, the Gibsons held their nerve, they kept strong, and they kept to their truth, and insisted upon a trial by jury, not guilty. The canna community resounded with applause and cheers at what seemed at first like a monumental victory. That the right to a private life in our pursuit of our best health, well-being and happiness to be finally respected, and for people to have the right to home grow their own cannabis for their own medical use. However, what we witnessed on the 6th of January was, perhaps, some shrewd strategising by the Crown Prosecution Service. The closing statements made reference to the fact that the CPS only decided it was not in the public interest to prosecute the Gibsons because they are now accessing a private prescription of cannabis for medical purposes at full cost. Furthermore, they stated that if the Gibsons were to repeat their actions and break the law again, they would face the ordeal of trial and potential prosecution all over again. As will any and all who choose to cultivate cannabis without having purchased a special licence from the Home Secretary first. However, the Gibson's legal team have announced that although no legal precedent was set by the outcome of what should have been a test challenge and the change to the law regarding the personal and private cultivation, preparation and sharing of cannabis for medical purposes, This immediate and apparent victory for the Gibsons is only short term, and they remain in the exact same dilemma they were before. They were attacked in the privacy of their own home by Cumbria police for the unlicensed cultivation of a nutritious therapeutic herb. Unless they continue to pay more than they can afford for the extortionate private prescription fees, Leslie will be left with few choices. Legally suffer, obtain cannabis of unknown quality from the unlicensed and uncontrolled cannabis market, or to legally, yet sustainably, cultivate cannabis to improve her health and maintain a dignified quality of life. Where is the equality and justice in this equation? Oh, I missed a paragraph. Effectively, a private prescription has become protection for the prosecution of those who can afford it. But what happens to those who are too poor to access private health care? We remain subject to unjust and inhumane prosecution for the exact same actions. Where is the equality and justice in that equation? The collapsed case against the Gibsons was still monumental, and although legal precedent was set, it has left the Department of Public Prosecutions with some very urgent questions to answer. Exactly when is it in the public interest to prosecute people who choose to home-grow cannabis to maintain their health or that of their loved ones, as it is more financially sustainable than purchasing from the pharmaceutical industry or safer than the unlicensed cannabis market? The WTU intend to expand on that question and include the adult uses of cannabis regardless of the purpose of the consumer, whether for nutritional, therapeutic, creative, spiritual or relaxational purposes. Where is the harm? Especially when compared with the recreational drug alcohol. When exactly is it in the public interest to prosecute peaceful people who choose to recognise and utilise cannabis for its broad spectrum of benefits and uses? Whether a person cultivates cannabis to consume for medical, nutritional, creative, spiritual or relaxational purposes, there is no difference in the level of harm to the individual, community or society on a whole. In fact, the only real threat created by the domestic cultivation of cannabis for private purposes is the loss of revenues for the pharmaceutical and alcohol industries, both of whom are heavily involved in lobbying the government to maintain the status quo of cannabis prohibition. Not to protect the people, but in order to protect their profits and investments. Where does this leave us, you might ask? Pretty much exactly where we were before. Anyone caught cultivating cannabis at home without a licence will still be subject to prosecution, even if for medical purposes, but may be able to escape prosecution if they purchase a private prescription and they cease seeking herbal independence and sustainability for themselves, by complying with purchasing extortionately priced, pharmaceuticalised, irradiated, lower quality cannabis from private healthcare specialists. This is British justice in the great British democracy. Truth and justice are dead in the UK, murdered by law and order in the name of profits. And what is the moral of the Gibson story? If arrested, challenge the charges, all the way to the jury. Insist your truth be heard, and that the Crown Prosecution Service present their foundation evidence for the Schedule 1 status of cannabis. Insist that your prosecution is not in the public interest, and that you break the law that is not fit for purpose and will harm your health if you abide by it. NHS guidelines deny patients lawful access, despite the law that any person can be prescribed cannabis for any condition so long as by a GMC registered specialist. Therefore, if you wish to access cannabis for medical purposes, you must pay through the nose for a private prescription. Or you can risk your health, future and personal security by buying from the unlicensed and uncontrolled cannabis market. Or you can risk prosecution if you choose to home grow for assured quality, affordability and sustainability. But what real choice remains for a poor person who has no way to afford a private prescription but can only afford seed and soil? At least now there is potential for the spotlight to finally shine upon cannabis prohibition laws and whether or not they are fit for purpose. Or another opportunity for the British government to mislead the people by maintaining their lie of cannabis prohibition. Aside from the fact that cannabis has great therapeutic benefits, it holds the solutions to impending environmental collapse that the fossil fuel industry seems hell-bent on delivering us. Cannabis prohibition laws have been crimes against humanity that have caused devastation to our community, our planet and the health of the people. The time for change is now. Please join the WTU movement to make it happen sooner rather than later. So, you know, it's not such a great triumph after all. Poor Leslie, as you may have seen in her interview, she now has to find over £700 a month. If she doesn't, she's got no cannabis. If she grows it again or gets someone to do it for you, she risks prosecution. Now, nothing's changed. All we have is the CPS saying it's not in the public interest to prosecute people, so long as they then start to pay through the nose for a private prescription. Now, I've got a letter from my specialist saying that cannabis helps me, that I should have cannabis, I shouldn't be prosecuted for my practices, but unfortunately they can't give it me because of NHS guidelines. Private prescriptions off the cards for me. I can barely afford to feed and clothe myself, let alone pay for things like that. But I can buy seeds and I can buy soil. And on that note, I've got some essential gardening to do. I've got no private prescription to protect me. If it was me in that courtroom, unfortunately, it wouldn't have been able to be thrown out on the same grounds as was just happened. I can't hand myself in. I've got 3 kids to raise by myself now. But they could still come for me at any time. So if they do, there's no prescription to protect me. So let's see what happens. On that note, you know, what else can poor people do but grow their own for themselves and fight the prosecution, challenge the charges? We will do everything we can as a community to support you, fundraising, anything else. That letter for your specialist is a de facto prescription. I actually take it as a de facto prescription as it happens, JJ. Whether the courts would or not, I don't know. Truthfully, I don't care. They are liars, they are deceitful and crafty. They don't care about truth and justice. All they care about is protecting the reputation of themselves, the law and the judicial system. If they actually cared about truth, justice and human rights in the slightest, they'd have been smashing that law to pieces. So on that note, all we can do is carry on doing what we're doing and try our best to challenge it in every way we can. I don't know what else to say. Well, we'll come and support you in court if you get nicked. Well, that's great, because I'll need the support if it comes to it. And if it comes, it comes. I'm at that point really, my health depends upon this. I've got nothing else I can do, so I'm doing what I have to do. And let's just see what happens. I'm not encouraging or advocating anybody else to break any laws, because that in itself would be a crime, of course. If your health depends on it, what are you going to do? Right, I've got to go. I've got some essential gardening to do. Lots of love, people. Speak soon. Take care.